It's extremely nice to be with you today. I'm here to talk about scaling Agile. Before I dig deeper, as Piotrek said, I'm currently a VP of Engineering of DaftCode, a startup hub. I'm also Agile coach at a company called Procognita. Before, I founded a company called El Passion. It's a Ruby on Rails software house. And I'm also one of the founders of Agile Warsaw, which is today the biggest and the most active Agile community in Poland. So all those four things, I started 7 years ago with Agile, and all those four things are heavily connected to Agile. So, scaling Scrum with LeSS. So what is LeSS? LeSS is a framework that allows you to scale Agile to up to 2,000 people. You can have 2,000 people in one project, and that one project is being run in Scrum, and LeSS tells you how to connect all those different Scrum teams into one big team for the project. Before we go into details, there is the first rule of scaling Scrum, which is don't do that. At any price, try to avoid scaling. Scaling is very expensive, fairly hard to do, and will bring you a lot of challenges in communication, and will give you a lot of problems that you will have solved along the way. So the best way to scale is to not to do that. You can do it, for example, by hiring 10 killer developers, paying them triple as much as the other company do, and having them code your project instead of having, for example, 50. You can also do it by simplifying the project. So at any cost, avoid scaling. Now, being that said, let's jump to LeSS. LeSS is split into two levels. So there is a framework level 1 that says how do we scale our teams up to 100 people. Actually, up to 10 teams, which might be more than 100 people, but say around 100 people. So let's start with roles. And whenever I'll be talking about LeSS, on your left-hand side, you will have how do you do that with Scrum, and on the right-hand side, you will have how do you do that with LeSS. So in Scrum, you have co-located, cross-functional team with end-to-end responsibility, with a Scrum Master and a product owner. Well, in LeSS, it's a little bit different, because you have multiple teams. And every of those teams need to be cross-functional. All of those teams needs to be, well, hopefully is co-located and has end-to-end responsibility. Now, each of them have a Scrum Master and product owner. And talking about product owners, we also have a structure of product owners. So every team has a product owner, and there is a chief product owner that is in charge of syncing and making sure that the product is consistent. So that's easy. Let's talk about artifacts. Let's start with product backlog. In Scrum, you have a product backlog, which is a to-do list, prioritized, more detail at the top, less detail at the bottom. And in LeSS, on the level 1, nothing changes. You still have a product backlog. This is one product backlog for all the teams that you have in your team or in your teams. And also at the end of each sprint in Scrum, you have a product increment. You have something potentially shippable, hopefully that is actually going to production. And nothing changes here in LeSS. At the end of each sprint, you need to have a fully tested, ready to go to production product, which means that up to 100, maybe 200 people are working on one product, and whatever they develop needs to be ready to go to production after the sprint. Let's talk about ceremonies. So, in Scrum, we have a sprint planning. The whole team meets and discuss what exactly we will do in the next iteration, what is our goal. We decide how our sprint backlog is going to look like. Well, in LeSS it's a little bit more complicated, because if you were to put 200 people, for example, in the room and make them discuss and plan their sprint backlog, it would be pretty challenging. So what we do in LeSS, we split planning into two parts. In the first part, everybody meets in the one room. First part usually lasts like 10-20 minutes, not a very long one. And the chief product owner says, okay, this is more or less what we want to do in the next iteration. This is more or less what we want to do in this team or in that team. And by the way, every team should be able to take any part of the backlog to the next sprint. And after that, teams will split into their own plannings and go into their own rooms and plan in detail the way they would plan in standard Scrum. Okay, next we have a daily stand-up. Again, it would be fairly difficult to have 100 or 200 people meet in one room and discuss what was done, what we plan to do, and what we need to make our work more efficient. So instead, like in Scrum, just having a Scrum meeting, we have a Scrum meeting in every single team. And then we have a daily stand-up of daily stand-ups. So we have a meeting on which representatives of each team meet and discuss what was done in particular teams, what is planned to be done in particular teams, and what they might need from each other to make their work more efficient. Well, going to review, surprise, surprise, it would be fairly difficult to have 200. Well, actually, yeah, we put all 100 or 200 or whatever is the amount of people into one room, and we do a review one by one. So every team presents what was done in the sprint. And those reviews are often not that long. It sometimes takes 15-20 minutes. So if you have 4 teams, if you have 8 teams, it might actually take an hour or 2 hours to sit in a room and get the understanding what is the status of the project. Let's move on. Sprint retrospection. So here again would be fairly difficult to do a retrospection for 100 or 200 people at a time. Although I actually know some people who did a retrospection for 100 people, but well, that's not how the LeSS is doing it. The way LeSS is doing it, it's similar to stand-ups. So everybody does a retrospection in their own team, and then representatives of each team, which might be Scrum Masters along with a couple of developers, might be usually 2-3 people from each team, meet and discuss of the retrospection of retrospections when they discuss what things can be improved. So in Scrum, you ask on retrospections all those questions and you want to produce improvements. What we're gonna change, what we're gonna improve in the next iteration. And in LeSS, you still do that at the level of every single team. But then you jump to the level the team escalates that they cannot change on their own. They need to change on the level of the whole process, on the level of the whole project. And that's the retrospection of retrospections, when they decide what they want to change in the whole project, in the whole process. Okay. Now, one of the biggest challenges that makes it so difficult to scale the project is when you want to keep things consistent. And it might be the architecture, it might be the product, it might be the design of the product, user interface. Any aspect might be really difficult to keep consistent. So the way of dealing it with LeSS is you do community of interest. So from every team you pick people at one specialization. So it might be, for example, architecture, it might be UX design, it might be integration, and they form a community of interest in which they meet regularly at the sprint basis and decide on details of how to implement architecture. And then through what is called human infection, they go back to their teams and they infect those ideas and they put that and promote in their teams. I personally believe it's one of the hardest things to do. So here it is, LeSS in summary. You have a chief product owner along with the product backlog. You start an iteration, you do a 2-level planning at the first, everybody meets at the first first part of the planning. Then you split into the teams, do your own plannings, do your own implementations, do your own stand-up, meet every day for a common stand-up, for a global stand-up. And at the end of the sprint, you deliver a working increment, and you deliver, and you do a review, and you do a retrospection first in the teams, and then a global one. So, sounds pretty simple, isn't it? No, okay. Well, it's not that easy. Okay, so now the question comes, how do we scale it to 100 teams? How do we scale it to 1,000 people or 2,000 people? Well, the way the LeSS addresses the issue is a little bit different at the level 1. So, in level 2, they said, people will be able only to recognize and understand, and will be only able to recognize people from about 100. Okay, if you have a tipping point, I don't remember what it is, but once your organization kind of past that point, you stop recognizing people on the corridor. You don't know who they are, you didn't even see them before. So on the framework level 2, we try to split our application into sub-products or sub-modules. And instead of having a one product backlog with this, which every story is exchangeable between any of the teams, we split into the so-called area product backlogs, which might be the area of functionality of application or might be a technology. So for example, TCP IP stack, if we have a big application that implements its own IP stack. So the idea is fairly easy, although the chart might not look that easy. You run a number of level 1 frameworks. So you have 100 people here, 100 people here, 100 people here, and so on. And each have its own area product owner. There is one chief product owner above all area product owners. And then you have area product owner, and then below them, below him, there is a number of product owners, and there is a number of teams in every, let's call it a department. So you simply try to run as decoupled as possible, as autonomous as possible number of departments. Okay, I won't go into detail. There is quite some more tricky parts in implementing LeSS, but well, in our format, I think that's what we can stop with. I would like to jump a little bit from theory to practice. So this year I had the occasion to work on one LeSS project. I was cooperating with Asseco company. We built a CRM for one of the biggest Polish GSM operators. To give you an idea of the complexity of the project, CRM might sound easy, but it also means it integrates a lot of different functionality. We're talking about order management, we're talking about integrating what's called telco with multiple other services. We talk about a lot of other systems that needs to be touched and customized, which are usually legacy systems. And we talk about integration and developing some other products. So what this all means in practice? Well, one thing is we had a team that was working in Scrum, and we had a team that was working in Waterfall, which was one of the challenges. Then only in Scrum teams we had over 80 people. There was over 7 Scrum teams. Actually, there were 7 Scrum. Well, actually now it's 8 Scrum teams. And we have nearly 1,000 user stories in the backlog. So, and on top of that, it's not like we could do whatever we wanted. There was a number of corporate constraints. Relatively short lifespan of the project, counted in months, not years, as usually the project of that size would be. We had to integrate with over 20 legacy systems. Well, there was a classical management layer that we had to do something with all those managers. The team was not co-located as we would wish it was. Well, and there is a number of policies. It's not like you can do anything in the corporation and it just happens. There is a lot of paperwork, a lot of stamps that need to be put before you can actually give someone access to the Git repository. So what we end up with looks a little bit like that. So we end up having as many generalized teams as we can, as many teams that could take any part of the backlog, and that's the 4 teams on the right. Now it's 5 teams. We also decided to have 2 specialized teams that will only focus on some area of the backlog. We also had an integration team, which was a separate Scrum team, and well, guess where most of the challenges were coming from. And then we have an architect team, which was going completely waterfall. So the integration team would be in charge of producing all the interfaces to legacy systems, while the architect team would be in charge of producing all the interfaces to even more legacy systems. Then we have a product owner team, which is by design part of LeSS, but we also decided to run it in Scrum. So they had their own plannings, daily stand-ups, reviews, and everything one might expect from the Scrum team. And finally, to implement servant leadership, we knew that we have to take managers a little bit away further from the teams, so we put them in their own Scrum team. And in their own Scrum team, they could do as much managing as they wanted, but also it was a great place where problems could be escalated from the teams, so that in corporation you need to be a right person in the right place, and usually the manager is in the right place and is the right person to do things. So this way they could relatively bug teams relatively low, and they could be relatively helpful. I think that's all for today. Thank you very much. Do I still have time? Okay. There is a person who has a question. Nice. That doesn't happen a lot these days. Well, it heavily depends on what kind of community of interest they're coming from. So if that would be an architect, the most preferable way they implement those changes is usually on technical plannings and via code review. So that would be the most agile leash way. The kind of agile corporate middle ground could be building a documentation that is minimal and accessible by the team. And of course, talking about it on the plannings, technical plannings. If that would be, for example, a product person or a design person, that they simply make sure that the whole team of UX specialists design a consistent interface and follow the same guidelines. So they don't really need to infect team that much, because simply it changes their deliveries to the team. So it really heavily depends on the community of interest, and I don't think I'm not sure, but my guess is that LeSS doesn't define that. It just says you need to go and promote the ideas and make sure the things are consistent. Does that answer your question? Okay, thank you. One more question or? Okay. Thank you.